Alright, so today we're going to be talking about what I'd like to think of as a shortcut that you can take when learning chess openings. Because the problem is when a lot of people try to learn chess openings, they go about it in all the wrong ways. They might try to think like, oh, I'm going to play the London system and, go the rest of my life, having everyone hate me, which if you're okay with that is, I guess, a way you could live your life. Another path that a lot of people go is like, I'm just going to buy this chessable course, I'm going to memorize every single line in it. But some people have kind of found out that's not so easy to do. And even when you do that, we're going to talk about this, but there are problems with just, plainly memorizing your openings, and like it can pay off. And when I was younger as a player and I'd go to tournaments and stuff, I would do this, and I had some results, of course, from just memorizing stuff. But at the end of the day, you can't memorize everything, and eventually there will be a point where at some point in the game you're gonna have to be on your own. And as scary as it is, right, you're gonna have to use your brain. And I know, like, when you play chess, you're like, oh, I don't want to use my brain, right? Like, that's not what chess is about. I thought chess was just, whoever memorizes the most, like, wins. Magnus Carlsen said classical chess is dead because of that. Truth be told, that's not the case for most of us, until you reach the 2800 level, I guess. And also another thing is that theory actually changes. And, you could be memorizing, like, something today, and in a year, that might just be completely irrelevant and quite frankly bad. I've had that experience before. To some extent, that is a thing that becomes more relevant as you become stronger. If you're like 1000 rated online or something, you can just completely ignore that. And also another thing I want to address, right, is like just some quick reality checks about like theory, because there are a lot of people who think like, oh, but you're telling me not to memorize theory, but everyone else seems to know so much theory. And the thing is, as someone who, and I don't say this to like, put myself up on like some pedestal or anything and be like, look how great I am, but I have learned a lot of opening theory, and I know more theory rather than most other players who are at my level, or even I'd say like on par with a lot of players who are like international master level. And the thing is that a lot of people like just do not know as much theory as you think. I've had so many games where I'm like, oh my god, they're gonna know like all these lines, I need to prepare all this stuff, and then I go to the board and they play like some line that I know is kind of bad, and I'm like, I spent all that time preparing just for them to like, do this crap, right? And that's like really the truth, that people just do not know as much as you think they do. And even the ones that do, right, like especially under a certain level, of course if they're like a grandmaster this won't be true most likely, but most people who like, let's say below a certain level, like under 2000 let's say, the ones who do know a lot of theory, they don't really have the understanding to back that up. Oftentimes, as I was just saying, right, like, when eventually there's going to be a point in the opening when you are kind of let out on your own, right? A lot of these types who like kind of seem very booked up and know a lot of theory, oftentimes the moment they get let out into the middle game, or the moment their opponent does something slightly different to what they've kind of seen before, they just start like, self-destructing, and it's madness. But also another just important mindset thing to have is like, it is very, very rare that you'll be losing games just entirely because you don't know like as much opening theory as your opponent. Will there be games where that happens? Yes, but it's definitely not the majority by any means, and in fact it is very rare. I cannot remember the last time that I lost one personally. Granted, that's because often I find myself knowing more theory than my opponents, but even in terms of myself like winning games because of the amount of theory I know, it's pretty rare. It happens, but it's just not that common. But anyways, this brings me to the main point of this video, which is why you should focus on structures, and by structures I mean like pawn structures, pawn formations, as opposed to theory. Hopefully you get what I mean by that. If not, I'm going to show examples. But this is different from kind of just understanding, like, people often saying like you should understand like the moves in opening, and while to a degree, like, yeah, that's not really what I mean when I say like understanding structures, because you can understand individual moves in an opening, like opening theory, and being like, yeah, I played this move here because they have this tactic, but that doesn't necessarily mean you understand how to play the middle game positions that you get from that opening, which are related to that pawn structure you have in an opening. And most openings have some sort of pawn structures that you get from them that are very common. For example, if you play the Caro-Kann, you would know that in the exchange variation you often get the Carlsbad pawn structure, and from there you very often have this thing called the minority attack, for example. But here's the thing, right? When you really understand like the heart of like what it is that you're aiming for in a particular pawn structure, as we're going to again show with the examples I'm going to bring up soon, it really helps when you're like going through the opening theory, because once you understand what you're aiming for in the middle game, it becomes a lot easier to really understand why you play certain moves in the opening. Or if you forget the theory, it's a lot easier to then figure out like, okay, I can't quite remember what to do here, but I'm usually going for these plans, and okay, therefore maybe putting my piece on this square is wrong because then I wouldn't be able to go for a certain plan, that sort of thing. And also if your opponent does something that's like not, you know, the book move or wasn't in your course, you can use the knowledge you already have and transfer that over into a different position, and you're not going to be spazzing out being like, oh my god, I don't know what to do, like, oh, and then just die. But before we get into the examples, just a quick plug, here's the Substack. I haven't been uploading that much in the last few months, but yeah, recently sent out an email to the people who were subscribed a few weeks ago, so yeah, if I don't upload for a few months, you might get an email here with some updates about things, some breakdowns and topics like these that I discussed on the channel. But anyways, on to the example. So I'm not just going to be going over one game here, I'm actually going to be going over two, and I'm not going to be trying to like do some complete recap or break down these games or whatever, because that would sort of detract a little bit away from the point that I'm trying to make. But anyways, this game, for context, we had d4, c4. I didn't go for g3 and kind of a more Catalan style thing like I talk a lot about on this channel. For this game, I decided that I was going to go for something a little bit different. It's pretty standard mainline King's Indian. If you don't know, a pretty standard kind of 1d4 opening. And the reason just being that I want to mix things up a little bit, and that is indeed what we got. So we have this position where we put the knight on d7. There's a very well-known line with knight c6, d5, and you can go knight e1, and there's this whole thing where they try to attack on the king's side. There's b4 as well. There's all this theory. But okay, my opponent goes for this game, knight d7. He's international master from Poland, by the way. I was playing this open tournament actually in Slovenia. I played in a few others. I won't go into huge depth now, all of what happened, but again, if you're interested in that, Substack, newsletter, you can check that out in the description, talk about it a bit there. But anyways, so rookie 1 is what I played. We have some moves, I won't go too much over these, but basically after a while we get this super locked up pawn structure. And this is exactly the type of position where, you know, just memorizing moves is not going to help you. And I can also tell you, like from this position, I hadn't memorized like moves. I'd seen similar positions before, I know the typical plans I'm going for, but I can't tell you like, okay, yes, like I know these 3 variations and whatever other bullcrap, right? So basically, like in a nutshell, how do I get rid of, okay, that, yeah, the arrows were kind of annoying me, but essentially from this position, what I understood is 2 things. White probably wants to get counterplay on the queen side, or maybe not even counterplay, but just play on the queen side in general with a3, b4, and also eventually what black wants to do is they want to rearrange their king side pieces in a way that they can eventually get an f5 in an effective manner. The only problem that they have is that it often is not so easy to actually achieve that in good conditions, especially if white can play a few key moves to really make that more difficult. So what I did here was I first of all played bishop g5, which pins the knight, and it might look like they can play h6 to kick the bishop, and if I go back, it doesn't really help so much because, you know, they're getting their knight here, they're going to put it on f4, eventually they're probably going to remaneuver this guy around, play f5, and they're having a pretty enjoyable life. But the key point was that after h6, I could put my bishop back onto d2. And it might kind of look a little bit weird, like why are we just giving them a free move with h6? But the thing is that I had seen this idea before. Not in this exact position, but in something very similar, where the moment black has to play h6, it makes achieving their whole key plan of f7 to f5 on the king side a lot more difficult. And the reason is, let's say for example they play a move like knight h7 here. What white can do is they can actually play this move g3, which looks a little bit weird because it seems like they're about to attack us on the king side, and why would we want to make a move like that could only just be weakening with this attack coming soon? But the problem is that now when they go f5, we have this move knight h4. This is very important, and this was allowed by the move g3, when now these pawns are very weak, and note that if their pawn was on h7, they would only have to be worrying about defending this f5 square. But because the pawn is undefended on g6, they have to worry about defending both of these guys. And this just makes for a very difficult position. For example, queen f6 might be one of the few moves they can play. Maybe also like knight f8, I guess, defends the pawn like that and like that. But now like what we can do, let's say knight f8 for example, we can go bishop h3, and then if they defend this, maybe we can go queen h5, and all the pressure is coming down on this guy on f5. It's becoming very difficult to play. If they try to push f4, then this is just admitting complete failure on their part, because now they lose control with e4 square, the knight can come in, and their light squares are just completely getting torn apart, especially since we're going to be able to exchange light squared bishops soon. So this really just makes things a lot more difficult for black, playing bishop g5, provoking h6, because if they don't play h6, then it's very difficult to move this knight out of the way eventually and achieve f5. So I'll just show how the game continued. I won't show the whole thing. He plays king h7, I go a3, b6, rook b1. I could play b4 immediately, but I decided to delay it a little bit. Queen c2, and again, I'm just kind of eyeing the queen at the f5 square. Now he goes knight h5, g3, and again, it looks like he's just about ready to go for f5, but because of my last move after f5, you might want to pause the video, try and think what white will play. But provided you thought about it, white again, we can just take on f5, takes, go knight h4, and this pawn is incredibly weak. It's very difficult to defend. If you go knight f6, probably bishop h3, and this pawn is just going to be basically dropping off the face of this earth very soon. So that's why he played knight df6. It looks a little bit weird what he does in the next few moves rather, but okay, it kind of makes sense. So b4, knight e8, and his whole thing was that f5 with the knight on d7 was a bit more difficult because f5 kind of lacks defenders, but now with the bishop covering the square, he thinks he can go for this. I play a4 now, and basically my idea was a few moves before, like, or let's say in this position, right, like he goes something like rook b8, let's just say he wastes some moves, right? I probably wouldn't want to go for a4 here because the knight sits on d7, and then after takes, it could quickly come into c5, f5 is coming, and the knight on c5 actually strengthens the f5 break, because like let's say if I take for example, or even if I don't, just in general, the knight and the pawn on f5 work in harmony to attack the e4 point. So this is just like a small subtle point that really shows like how, or what it means rather, to understand the structure, like small differences in where the pieces are placed and how that affects kind of your play. Like now I'm not as concerned about like them getting the c5 square because they can't as easily put a knight there. It's going to take a long time, like knight f6, knight d7 and c5, but by the time he does that, I feel like I'm already going to be getting a5 in and kind of tearing apart the queen side a little bit. So turns out there was something stronger. White could even take. I was a little bit annoyed by the idea of d takes c5 and then knight coming to the d6 square and getting f5, but when I analyzed the computer I realized it wasn't an issue because there's actually knight b5 you can play, challenging knight, getting rid of it, and while the knight is usually very strong in d6 square, if I can just kind of exchange it off like this, it's not much of an issue. So yeah, white had reasonable advantage at this point. I'll just show how things played out in the next few moves. So he finally played f5, he took for the bishop because again takes, knight h4 is probably going to be a little bit unpleasant, so bishop f5, bishop d3, takes, And in this position, yeah, white's quite comfortably better. We control the e4 square quite nicely. We're going to play knight h4 probably quite soon, when it's going to be difficult for black to avoid a trade of darks with bishops. And again, the light squares are going to be quite weak in this position. G6 as well. This knight in h5 is quite misplaced. All in all, white just stands to have a pretty good position, all things being considered. And eventually I went on to lose the game when things got very complicated later on in the endgame. Objectively, I was winning, but okay, I just want to show though what happened in the next round though. This was the next day. I was feeling very depressed after my game. The previous day, I was beating an international master, then I went on to lose, and I'm feeling bad for myself and stuff, but I was like, okay, life has to go on. And I was playing this Slovenian kid who's like about 1950, whatever rating you see on the screen, here FIDE rated, and I'm like, oh god, I'm playing like a kid, but at the same time I'm like, okay, I can't whine too much, just have to turn up and just play chess basically. So we had an English, and I'm black by the way, so this is like a completely different opening to what we saw yesterday. But look what's going to happen in the next few moves, right? So we have this, and it looks like it's probably going to be some sort of Benoni structure after this, with reverse colors that is. So luckily I'm a d4 player with white as well, so I know how to play the Benoni structure. But if I didn't, this actually might be a bit difficult. Anyways, though, that's a bit of a different topic. What we ended up getting though was e4, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to play e5, and my opponent actually, he was spending a bit of time thinking, and I was like, well, it's kind of weird because most people who play like the English, like they sort of know when they get to these sort of positions, they just take and they try to play like this reverse Benoni position. But he played e4, and then, well, I was thinking again while he was thinking, sorry to repeat myself, but maybe he will actually go for this, which in the end he actually ends up doing. And basically now I play e5 because I also want to have some space in the center. And it was funny because I'm like, this is almost the exact same position I had yesterday. Okay, there are some differences. My rook's not on e8, my bishop is on d6 instead of being on f8. His knight is not yet on d2, he is a pawn on b3. But more or less, right? Like, if we come back to this game, and like the position we had, like here, right? It's basically the same pawn structure, just with colors reversed. And so all of my knowledge that I had from like that middle game type of position and that I was using yesterday, I could apply here as well. And I wasn't sure whether my opponent actually carefully looked at that game, because a lot of players, right, when they prepare for especially tournament games, they often kind of just look at the opening, and if it's like with a different color, they don't look at it that carefully. So especially if they're like a younger player, they tend to have that sort of approach. So I wouldn't have been surprised if my opponent kind of just brushed over that game, didn't really see how I actually handled the middle game. And when he got here, I don't think he actually really understood these sort of King's Indian structures very well, because in the next move he played h3. And from what we saw in the last game, you remember with the like reverse colors, I played bishop g5, okay, now it's bishop g4, provoked h3, and then went back to d7, because when you do this, it makes achieving, as I was talking about, f4 a lot more difficult. But now my opponent played like h3, but that was without me even playing bishop g4, which to me immediately signaled that he did not really understand kind of, you know, the typical ideas in this sort of position, right? So what I did is I played very similar to how I did the day before, a6, eventually aiming to get in b5, or maybe not eventually, but very soon. He plays knight h2, and you might like to pause the video here and think about, after knight h2, you know, given everything we've talked about, how would black play here? And again, without much hesitation, I played g6, because I knew that, you know, if you play g6 here as black, it makes f4 a lot more difficult to play, especially once you've played h3. Knight h5 becomes very strong, targeting these guys who will become a weakness. So my opponent actually didn't go f4, he went bishop to g5, which looks like it might be an extra option that white gets, because they have not played knight d2. But fortunately, black can break the pin pretty easily, and it's not an issue. I should also say though that if they do go f4, this is a mistake, and already after like knight h5, the computer says this is like -2 pretty much, because again, these two pawns are attacked. And another thing is, right, if possible, you would like to meet this with f5, but remember, this would be possible if the pawn was on h2 and this knight is somewhere else, let's just imagine. But because they have played this, they are not in time to do so, and they have to spend the whole move, apologies, where were we? They have to spend a whole move defending like these guys. So like, let's say queen f3, and now black can, let's say, go takes, and we have a few different things we can do, but I quite like this idea of f6, and we can just kind of fix these pawns in place. If they go f5, we get knight e5. If they go e5, then we take. And what we can do is we can just spend the next few moves piling up the pressure, like queen c7, bishop d7, rook a8, and let's just say with the next few moves, everything I was mentioning, and now we have a very nice move, knight d8, knight e6, and it's very difficult to see how to deal with this weak pawn on f4. So bishop g5, bishop e7, and really what my opponent should do is just not play f4. Like anything else other than f4 is like probably what he should do. Instead, what does he do? He plays f4, and then I'm like, okay, knight h5, and even more so in this position, I thought this was good, because now the problem is that this bishop is like a very, because like all of their pawns are on light squares, right? So that bishop is kind of their good bishop, and when that gets swapped off, all the dark squares get weakened even more. So I would have been very happy to get this. Now it's a queen f3, take. We could still go for something like f6, but another idea is also f5. I'm threatening to go take, and then rack up the f4 pawn. If they go e5 now, which looks tempting, this pawn is a weakness, and black again has this idea knight d8, knight e6, and also maybe queen h4 if necessary, and that pawn on f4 is looking like it is gone. So instead, I keep doing this, don't I? So knight h5, instead what he did though, he plays bishop h6, and like, I kind of was thinking, okay, maybe he can do this, but at the very least I just go rook e8, and you still have all the same issues to deal with. Maybe this bishop's even a little bit stuck. But then I was thinking, I'm like, okay, I can go rook e8, but like, I don't have to actually. I can maybe even just take this. And I was thinking about it for a few minutes, and then eventually I was like, you know what, let's just do it, right? Because after takes, I can't exactly take that because I'll be down a piece after all the exchanges, but what I can do is I can just take back basically. And then when you actually look at the position after rook f2, for one thing, black can just take this, and you can't really take back because after bishop h6, the rook basically only has f2 to go back to, but then you're going to be losing the exchange anyway. And after that, black will be a pawn up at the very least, and be positionally winning on top of that if being up a pawn was not enough, which it never is. But instead I just decided actually I can go bishop h6, and because you know, after e takes f4, I'm like, oh, they don't have to take back, maybe they can try and keep things somewhat closed, and maybe my bishop will have a tough time getting to the game. I'll still like, you know, this should be good. The computer says -3 by the way, so even though material is technically equal, the position is completely and utterly hopeless for white, as it is also after bishop h6, when like, yeah, they can play knight d2 and try to hang on for dear life, but like, let's be real, all of black's pieces are coming in. White's like, also like, you have to keep in mind, white is up the exchange technically for, yes, 2 pawns, but rooks are better when they have a lot of open lines, which in this position white's rooks really lack, right? So it's also important to understand from that perspective that their extra rook here, especially, you know, given the fact not only are there not many open lines, but just their rooks at the moment are kind of far away, especially this rook on a1 is far away from the action. It's really not a beneficial situation though. So given this was a pretty desperate situation, my opponent plays f takes e5, allowing black to win back the exchange, but yeah, the game ended pretty soon. This was just never going to work. e6 even allows queen f6, and after takes, he just resigned, because if the queen goes back, then there's a rook f8, and it's not even just winning the exchange back, it's just winning a whole rook clean. So pretty quick game, but like, again, I was basically just able to win based off of my like knowledge of how to play this pawn structure. I don't think I've ever reached this pawn structure before when playing the English as black, right? But because I knew this pawn structure with white, when I got it with reverse colors, I was able to apply all that knowledge again and basically have a pretty effortless win. Like when this game ended, I'd probably spent about a total of maybe 20-25 minutes, and my opponent had been down to his last like 10 minutes or something like that. Maybe he actually had a bit more time, might have been more like 20, but you get what I'm saying. I barely had to think the whole game. I knew how to kind of handle certain things, how to meet, them trying to go from like f4. And the moment, my opponent played h3, like I was able to look at that and be like, yeah, that's not right. Yeah, anyways, that's going to be about it for the video. This is my quarterly video for the second quarter of 2025. Hopefully I'm kidding, but anyways, if you want to work with me more and you want to actually improve your game and get help from me personally, I have a coaching form down in the description below. Again, if you're interested, go fill that out. But anyways, for the rest of you, if you liked the video, please like it, and if you've stuck around until the end of the video, comment Google Slides down below to show that you have stuck around until the end. But anyways, that's going to be it for now. Yeah, see ya.